Let me tell you just a little bit about the genesis of this event. This is actually the fourth session of a short class that I had offered on animal ethics this fall. The classes had to do with a range of issues regarding our relationship to animals, including factory farming and the ethics of hunting, the ethics of keeping pets as companion animals, the ethics of zoos and game parks and circuses, all those different kind of issues. And of course, we couldn't really complete the discussion without having some kind of a session on the ethics of animal experimentation. And decided that because the issue is so salient here in Madison, and clearly it's drawn a lot of attention and a lot of press, there's been a lot of debate both ways, that it would be best to open up that final session for a larger audience. And so that is where we are at this afternoon. So we do have three panelists, and we're going to spend the first 50 minutes with their thoughts, their presentations, their ideas, their take on the subject. And the first person that is going to speak is going to be John Webster, and John Webster is a founding pioneer in the field of biomedical engineering. He's also a member of this congregation. His 1978 textbook, Medical Instrumentation, Application, and Design, is considered to be the classical textbook in the field. He's authored and edited numerous other articles and textbooks, including a more recent publication, Bioinstrumentation. He's currently Professor Emeritus at the College of Engineering here at UW, and he teaches Biomedical Engineering 310, the Introduction to Bioinstrumentation. He works with undergraduate biomedical engineering design teams at the university and is still very, very heavily involved in research. Our second speaker, who has spoken on numerous occasions on this issue, is Eric Sandgren, Doctor of Veterinary Medicine and PhD, who is the Associate Professor of Experimental Pathology in the Department of Pathobiological Sciences at the Veterinary Medical School. He's also Director of the university's Research Animal Resource Center, whose functions are, as described on their website, to provide veterinary and laboratory services in support of quality animal care, to provide the support and training necessary to provide the highest quality care possible for the university's research animals, to provide oversight and assistance in assuring compliance to all laws, regulations, and rules governing the care and use of laboratory animals, and then finally, to conduct direct and collaborative research and/or consultation on animal models for biomedical research. Well equipped to speak on the subject. And then our third speaker this morning, Rick Bogle, is co-director of the Alliance for Animals, co-founder of the Primate Freedom Project. And the latter, the Freedom Project, is a loosely organized group of Madisonians that includes school teachers, UW employees, healthcare workers, business people, retirees, students, moms and dads, artists, and others, and whose purpose is to educate ourselves and others about monkeys, their minds and emotions, and the way they are used at the University of Wisconsin and at Covance Industries. The website says that the organization Primate Freedom Project advocates for primates, speaks out for them. We write letters, we hold public planning meetings, and public educational presentations on a regular basis. And the goal is to end primate experimentation in Madison. And Rick is also the author of the book Vegan Nation. And he also, of course, has spoken many, many times on this topic. So we're pleased to be able to present this opportunity to sharing our views. And what will happen is we'll have these three presentations and then open the process up immediately for your own comments and questions. And then I will moderate that comment session. So with that, John Webster will be our first presenter.
Hi, I'm John Webster. My genes and my environment directed me toward becoming an electrical engineer. After a while, I thought I could put some of these skills to use to make the world a better place, and I went into biomedical engineering. Some of you may have been in hospitals recently, and you see all kinds of equipment, and it's designed by electrical engineers and other engineers, and that's what I do, try to develop improved devices. Well, one of the first devices I got into was people have a heart, and the heart sometimes can have unusual rhythms. And these can be corrected by devices. I'll show you one. This is the catheter, and it goes in the arm and around into the heart. and it forms ablation. Ablation means to destroy tissue. And sometimes the heart can get sort of a dog chasing its tail, and if you can get this little electrode here in the right place and apply electrical power, you can cook it and kill it, and then this dog chasing the tail stops, and then the heart goes back into a normal beat. I'll pass this around.
Hope I never need it.
So we work to improve these devices, and we have to make certain determinations. That is, if you have a small amount of power, it doesn't work. If you have too much power, it chars and burns in a way that is bad. So you have to experiment and adjust these things. How do you know if your experiments are working right? Well, we used animals, okay? Because I don't think anyone here would volunteer for my experiments. And so we used pigs. And so working with the pigs helped us verify the improvements we made in this device that I'm passing around in order to get it ready for use in humans. Now, when I first started my career, I could have made something in my garage and gone out and sold it on the street. But in 1976, the Food and Drug Administration says, no, we want to know if any medical device is safe and it's useful, has efficacy. And so you have to prove to the FDA with a few documents that it works that way. So we can get documentation from animal experiments that helps human health. Well, a few years later, a surgeon approached me and said, basically, that because most of the people in the room eat the Western diet, which doesn't have adequate roughage, we tend to get colon cancer. And colon cancer migrates frequently to liver cancer. And liver cancer, the 5-year survival rate is close to 0, unless you do something about it. What you can do about it is you can put a probe into the cancer in the liver, similar to this, turn on the power, heat it up, cook it, kill it, and that changes the 5-year survival rate to 30%, which is better than 1%. So we work on improved devices in order to do this. And again, I don't think you'd want to volunteer for my experiments, good, better, best, but we used animals, and we're able to come up with the correct amount of power to apply for a certain size heating, for a certain size cancer. Well, a little later, the same surgeon said, we can get a survival rate much better if we can open up, if this is your liver and the cancer's near one end of the liver, just cut it off. Currently, it takes about an hour. They have to cut a little bit, coagulate it, cut a little bit, coagulate it, a lot of blood loss and everything else. So we've invented a device that's sort of like a comb. You just stick it in there like that, and then you run the electricity between the prongs of the comb, and in about 5 minutes, you can coagulate the whole thing, cut it off, and the operation's over. It saves a lot of blood, and the survival rate's much better, and it cuts down on the operating time. Well, then most of you may have heard of a taser that the police use to bring people down in place of a gun. And I believe the taser saves a lot of lives. Nevertheless, there have been about 300 cases where someone's been shot by a taser and they die. Okay? Now the question is, does the taser kill them or not? Well, our Department of Justice and the U.S. government asked me to answer the question, can a taser kill a human being or not? Well, I needed subjects, and I had to determine how close the dart of the taser could get to the heart before it went into ventricular fibrillation and death. I didn't get any volunteers. But a pig, you can get a pig, size I am, and the anatomy is very similar. And we ran a lot of experiments, and we were able to answer the question of how close the dart needs to get to the heart to cause ventricular fibrillation and death. Since that, the taser company that used to train police to shoot the dart right there says, don't do that anymore, based on my research. And so now they shoot it somewhere away from the heart and hopefully prevent electrocution, very rarely. So there's that story. Well, right now I'm working on something else. There's a condition called hydrocephalus. Normally, our body nourishes the brain, and then the fluid has to drain out. And in about one baby in 500, it doesn't drain. And so the pressure builds up in the brain and eventually destroys the brain and kills the child. Okay, so they go in, they put in a drain, a plastic pipe, and that solves the problem, except that about 40% of these drains, tissue gets into it and plugs it up. So the parent is told to look for certain symptoms because there's no way of knowing when it gets plugged up. So let's say you live in northern Wisconsin, 6-hour drive from the clinic here, and your kid wakes up with a splitting headache. What do? You either get in the car and you drive 6 hours down here, or you try to wait it out. I mean, it's a tough decision. So we're trying to develop a permanently implantable device, drill a little skull hole through the skull, put in the pressure sensor, put it back together, and then just like a radio frequency identification tag, every morning the mother could come in and read the pressure and see if it's all right, regardless of the symptoms the child would come up with. So how are we going to test this thing to prove to the FDA that it works, or that it works well for years? Most people would not volunteer their child. So we use animals. So that's the kind of thing that I do, and I feel that the use of animals is required because we don't get human volunteers for most of this. And if you want any of these new devices to help healthcare, we have to prove to the FDA that they work and that they work well. I'll stop there.
In case you've forgotten, I'm Eric Sandgren. I am a member of the faculty at the veterinary school. I do research with mice, actually. But I'm also the director of the Research Animal Resources Center, which is the administrative unit on the campus that has oversight responsibility for animals in research. So whenever there's an emotional issue like this, whether it's animals in research or some other issue, you always have a very complicated story. And sometimes you have to address that complexity. There are other times when you need to step back from that and make things simple. So that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to make things simple. I'm going to basically solve all the issues, and we can go home. There probably won't be any questions. But I think that one of the things that I've learned is that yes, you do have to recognize that there are many different perspectives, but we all need to step back sometimes and develop sort of an organizing framework for how to approach this, and I'm going to try to help a little bit with that, give you some suggestions based on what I know. So the first thing I'm going to say, and I'm sorry to say this, you really can't believe anything that you hear. You're going to have to do the work yourselves and look into it, and that's not easy. So, for example, you will hear people say very sincerely that biomedical research with animals has been an underlying factor involved in nearly every biomedical breakthrough that we've had in the last 100 years. You will hear people say very sincerely that biomedical research basically has contributed nothing at all to the development of our understanding of medicine and therapeutics in the last 100 years. Now either one of them is wrong and the other's right, or they're both wrong, but they can't both be right. And sometimes when I find myself listening to discussions about this issue, I think back to some of the cartoons, some of the comics that I read when I was a kid, and some of the science fiction where there are alternate realities, and you flip back and forth between alternate realities. And I feel that way because the things that I'm hearing can't possibly coexist in a single reality. That's how I feel. There's such a difference of opinion. So that puts you in an awkward position. If you really want to follow up on this issue, you're going to have to do some work, and that's not easy. I have a veterinary degree, I have a PhD. It was 2 years into my PhD when I really started to understand, that's how you ask and answer a scientific question. So if you really want to understand whether or not science has produced advances, you have to understand a little bit about research. And I think what John did was just exceptionally good, bringing this down to a very immediate level and demonstrating how you go about performing research, drawing conclusions from that research, and then changing your practices based on that. But you'll also hear people who will dispute everything he had to say there. So again, you're going to have to do the work. That's the first thing I want to say. The second thing I want to say is that as constituted right now in this country, in many countries in the world, biomedical research with animals is a highly regulated process. There's a lot of oversight. You'll hear widely divergent opinions as to whether that oversight works or not, but the fact of it is that there is a tremendous amount of oversight. In fact, in terms of the regulations and in terms of how public the findings of oversight bodies are, animal research is regulated similarly to, if not more stringently than, the things that go on in hospitals in medicine. So there's a lot more information out there about the mistakes that are made in biomedical research with animals than there is about the mistakes that are made in hospitals. So I'm stating that just to sort of set a background for what I expect will be questions. It's a regulated process. Investigators are not able to do what they want to and follow their every whim. Their proposals have to be evaluated ahead of time by a group that considers a number of things, including ethical considerations. Okay, the third thing, and this has to do, I think, with what is your responsibility in all of this. The issue of deciding whether use of animals in research or use of animals in anything or use of people in anything, the issue of deciding whether those things are ethical is really up to you. Now, that doesn't mean that we all can have our own ethics and we're all right and, it's just free-for-all. No, not at all. What that means is that if you are intelligent people, you will think about the issue. There will be certain basic principles that you hold to be true, and you'll build those in together with facts that, as I mentioned, you can't just believe without looking into a little bit. You will come up with an ethical perspective that you feel comfortable with. Sometimes you'll do that in the concert of others, in a religious setting, for example. There are a number of different contexts where you can do that. But it is ultimately your responsibility to do that. There was a recent proposal at the level of the Dane County Board that a panel should be set up to determine whether non-human primate research was ethical. And they would report back to the board. And there'd be 7 to 9 people from the county who would make that determination. And some parts of that proposal were fine, but it had a fatal flaw. And that is, this committee is supposed to decide for all the rest of us and tell us whether or not primate research is ethical. Well, what the example I use there is, I have a number of friends here who think just the opposite of what I think, and I'll call them animal activists, and they have strong positions, they have strong beliefs, and they have come to them in a variety of ways. It's not my business to question those ethical beliefs. I can question, and I do question, some of their statements because they're incorrect, but I can't really question their ethical beliefs. Let's say this panel found that it was ethical to use animals in research. Somehow I just can't imagine them all going, oh, we were wrong. We didn't, this panel had its findings and now we have to abide by it. That's ludicrous. That's not the way these kinds of ethical things can move forward. Or what if 4 thought it was ethical and 3 thought it wasn't? Does that mean it's 4/3 ethical? So if you want to get information about animal research, by all means get information. But don't try to tell everybody else how they should think, because that's not your business. I'm going to really stop there. There's each of these we can go into in much greater depth. We can build back in as much complexity as any of you want. And I think that's a good thing, but I would rather save that for the questions. Thank you.
It's great that you all came today, so let me see. I thought I'd start with something from Dr. Wayne Dyer. My wife gave me this and she said, you should start with this, so I know who to listen to. He said, and I don't know what book this is from, but he says, when it was time for the unspeakably horrid practice of slavery to be abolished, that was an idea whose time had come. This was because a critical mass of individuals with a new vision for humanity began to contemplate something that had been espoused a few generations earlier. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. It took more than 85 years after Thomas Jefferson wrote these words, but then the idea couldn't be stopped. And even though the slaves represented a tiny part of the population and had no voting rights, it was an idea whose time had come. Dyer goes on and talks about other ideas whose time had come. He talked about voting rights for women, racial integration, gay rights, even smoking in public places. He finishes, I could go on and on with examples of such ideas manifesting in our society. But instead, I propose that we begin looking around us for evidence of ideas whose time has come. You see, when we're ready, willing, and open to it, the divine guidance we'll seek, the divine guidance we seek will spring into action on our behalf. And this leads me to my main point today. The idea that we should use someone's species to determine whether it's okay to hurt them is as odious as the idea that we should use someone's race. The shape of our bodies and the fluency of our speech is no more important than the color of our skin or our sex, and anything other than our ability to suffer. This is the idea I hope you take home with you today. When we talk about animals in research, there's 3 or 4 discussions that usually sort of overlap and interlock. One of those discussions that we started today with Dr. Webster, he talks about, does the research work? Do the experiments on animals lead to benefit for us? Another thing we can talk about that Dr. Sandgren mentioned was, how is the research, what's the oversight like? How is it regulated? How are the animals used? What do they actually do to them? And then the other question, of course, is the animal question itself. Do we have the right to hurt them? Do we have the right to use them? Or do they have the right not to be used and hurt? So those are three sort of questions. I think the last one, I think the animal question sort of supersedes the others, because how we answer that will determine whether or not we need to think very carefully about the regulatory mechanisms and the oversight. If it's wrong to use them, if it's immoral to do that, then in fact the regulation doesn't make any difference at all, even if it does what it's supposed to do. But let me first talk about efficacy. Does it work? And rather than make things up, as Eric says, don't listen to them, that they'll tell you wrong things. Let me quote from a couple recent articles. The first one is from the May 15th, 2010 Newsweek. It's written by Mary Carmichael and Sharon Bogle. Sharon Bogle is a fairly well-known science author. She writes for the New York Times and for Newsweek. The title of the piece is Desperately Seeking Cures: How the Road from Promising Scientific Breakthrough to Real-World Remedy Has Become All But a Dead End. They start out. From 1996 to 1999, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration approved 157 new drugs. In the comparable period a decade later, the agency approved 74. Not among them were any cures or even meaningfully effective treatments for Alzheimer's disease, lung or pancreatic cancer, Parkinson's disease, Huntington's disease, or a host of other afflictions that destroy lives. They go on. From 1998 to 2003, the budget of the NIH, which supports such research at universities and medical centers as well, doubled to $27 billion, and it's now at $31 billion. Actually, this last year, it was $41 billion because an extra $10 billion was put in as part of stimulus funds. There's very little downside, they write, for a president or Congress in appeasing patient advocacy groups as well as voters by supporting biomedical research. But judging by the only criterion that matters to patients and taxpayers, not how many interesting discoveries about cells or genes or synapses have been made, but how many treatments for diseases the money has bought, the return on investment to the American taxpayer has been approximately as satisfying as the AIG bailout. They finish, more and more policymakers and patients are asking, where are the cures? Here's a recent article from November 2010. That's next month. It's from the Atlantic magazine. The title of the piece is Lies, Damned Lies in Medical Science. And they sum up, they say, much of what medical researchers conclude in their studies is misleading, exaggerated, and flat out wrong. Here's an article from the 2007 British Medical Journal. It's titled Translating Animal Research into Clinical Benefit. They sum up, poor methodological standards in animal studies mean that positive results rarely translate to the clinical domain. Here's an article from PLOS Medicine 2010. It's called Can Animal Models of Disease Reliably Inform Human Studies? There's summary points, and I quote, the value of animal experiments for predicting the effectiveness of treatment strategies in clinical trials has remained controversial, mainly because of a recurrent failure of interventions apparently promising in animal models to translate to the clinic. They say translational failure may be explained in part by methodological flaws in animal studies, leading to systemic bias and therefore to inadequate data and incorrect conclusions about efficacy. They say failures also result because of critical disparities, usually disease-specific, between animal models and the clinical trials testing the treatment strategy. There's another article from a 2007 British Medical Journal. The title is Comparison of Treatment Effects Between Animal Experiments and Clinical Trials, Systematic Review. I don't know how many of you read the British Medical Journal, but in the articles, the editors themselves pull out the key points. And these are the key points that the editors of the British Medical Journal pulled out from this study. They say, first, what's already known on this topic? The editors write, the relevance of animal models to human health is questioned because of differences between the species. And then they say what this study adds. Many studies in animal models are of poor methodological quality. They lack concordance between animal experiments, and clinical trials may be due to bias, random error, or the failure of animal models to adequately represent human disease. There really is a growing body of research. For a long, long time, people just assumed that all of this animal research must be leading to some sort of human benefit. Just recently, really within just the past maybe 5 or even fewer years, people have been doing systematic meta-analyses looking at the results of animal experimentation, and the results are fairly uniformly poor. The next thing is, and I'll just leave you with that. We could go in and talk for a long time about whether it works or not, but apparently many of the people looking at it think that there's cause for alarm. So animal care and use. How are the animals used, and how is it regulated? And so let me first say that, as Eric said, this is a very difficult sort of thing to find out about. I'm just going to guess that most of you can't easily sit down and find out very easily what's going on. But in fact, I've been working pretty hard to find out. So let me first tell you why it's so hard to find out. First thing I want to talk to you about is censorship. This is, just to start out, you won't be able to see this. I'll leave these pictures up here. You can come see it later. This is from a recent study, actually just published from the University of Wisconsin here, by a researcher named Louis Populin. And this paper had to do with the fact that they've discovered monkeys looking in the mirror and examining unseen parts of their bodies that they couldn't see. For a long time, we thought only chimpanzees and humans did those sorts of things. But the study by Populin now actually shows that he has videos online of monkeys doing this. But the interesting thing here is that in his studies and his other work, he's bolting these things into the tops of their heads. And in the pictures that they published in the journals, they've actually censored out. You can't see, they've actually blocked that out, so you can't see the hardware in the monkeys' heads in a scientific journal. So do they not want scientists to even see what's on the? No, they know that the public will see and be concerned, but it's odd that they would do that. Even in there, you can't see this in the reflection of this monkey, even in the reflection, they've marked out that little bit of this hardware in the top of his head. This censorship isn't really new. This is a Newsweek magazine, and this is a picture of a monkey that's actually you can't see, but he's in a restraint device. He's in a chair, he's strapped into place, and he has something bolted into the top of his head. But the way that this picture's been cropped, you can't see that. You also don't know, that they don't talk to you about this in the article, is that he's getting a sip of water because he's fluid deprived. He's thirsty all the time. That's what makes him perform in the way that the scientists want him to. This is fairly new. This is fairly new censorship. Not too long ago, this is from July 1971. Here's a Newsweek where they would actually put this sort of stuff on the cover. But this is around the time that Peter Singer wrote his famous book, Animal Liberation. And so at this time, around this time, they started censoring these images much more carefully. And now you just don't see them. Even in the scientific journals I showed you, they've blocked out the things in his head. So then one of the ways we find out what's going on is we ask for documents from the university. We do open records requests and ask. Sometimes we get some pretty interesting things, but sometimes we don't. This is an example of the sort of thing that you can get by asking for information from the university. This is an extreme case. Every page isn't this way. But this one, this actually has to do with a woman named Mary Schneider, who studies the effects of alcohol on developing fetuses. And it's not proprietary. She's not trying to create a new drug or anything. It's hard to say why this is blacked out. Since I can't read it, I don't know. Animal care use. So how do we find out what's going on? Well, we read scientific papers. Here's an example. This is a paper from 2004. It's called Novel Restraint System for Neuroendocrine Studies of Socially Living Common Marmoset Monkeys. So here's, in this paper, they describe, this is actually a very rare paper because it's rare in the sense that there's actually a drawing of the thing that they're inventing. This is a paper about a device that they invented to keep marmoset monkeys restrained in this way. In this study, they talked about keeping them restrained in this way for 3 days at a time. 3 days they were kept in this thing. There's a tube going down into the tops of their heads, going deep into their brain, to the very base of their brain. In fact, they're going all the way to the pituitary, which rests at the bottom of the skull. They're pumping chemicals into the base of their brain and sucking them out. It's called a push-pull perfusion. Also, you can't see in this picture, but they also have their jugular vein has a thing. But this is, so this is how we find out what's going on to some degree. As I said, this is a very unusual paper in the fact that there's actually even a picture. There are no pictures any longer. It used to be many, many years ago, there were almost always drawings in scientific journals about the way the animals were being used. But now that's no longer the case. It really has gone underground. So that brings me to then, we sort of have an idea about what's going on to the animals. We know because of federal documents about how many are used. We know in the Madison area there's about 9,000 monkeys used annually. There's more monkeys used in Madison. Get this, there's more monkeys used in Madison than any European nation. There's more monkeys used in Madison than almost any state in the United States. Madison really is, in a sense, the monkey experimentation capital of the world. So let's talk about oversight a little bit. If all of this is going on, maybe it's all really well regulated. Maybe it's all done very humanely. Well, there's really two ways that the research is regulated. One is through NIH, and one is through the USDA. The NIH has an office called the Office of Laboratory Animal Welfare. They require that anybody using covered species, actually NIH requires anyone using vertebrate species, will submit something called an assurance to the NIH, and they promise that they'll follow a book called The Guide to the Care and Use of Animals in Research. It's just called The Guide. The other branch of the government that regulates animal research is the USDA. They monitor and regulate something called the Animal Welfare Act. The Animal Welfare Act is actually a statutory, it's actually a law. The NIH is all regulatory. The OLAW, or NIH, doesn't visit universities or facilities. They rarely do, but they rely on correspondence. USDA, on the other hand, actually does annual inspections. They actually go to the labs around the country. They also go to circuses and zoos and all that. Any covered species used in the United States, USDA is required to inspect, and they're required to do those inspections annually. So how do their inspections work out? Well, there's been two recent reports from the USDA Office of the Inspector General. One of those had to do with inspection of laboratories, and the other one had to do with inspections of large dog breeders or puppy mills. Both Office of Inspector General reports said that the inspections were inconsequential, essentially, that they had no effect on the activities of the facilities that they were inspected. USDA has they've announced that they're going to take a harder line on this, that they're going to now start trying to levy stricter fines, heavier fines. In one of the reports, on the report on the oversight of the laboratories, the Inspector General's report said that most facilities feel that the small fines that they are levied at times are just a cost of doing business. Right now, let me show you the inspection reports. Usually, when there's an inspection, we'll get something that looks like this. So just a single page says everything looked good. And this tends to be the more routine sort of inspection reports you get. But occasionally, we get something else. Here at the University of Wisconsin, there have been quite a string of whistleblowers contacting NIH and USDA over the animal care and use here at the university. It's gone on long enough and insistently enough that finally, in a very rare move, the NIH and USDA last year did a joint inspection of the university. The result of that was a 10-page report from USDA. Nearly 100 violations of the Animal Welfare Act. Some of them quite serious: lack of veterinary care, lack of an effort to try to find alternatives for painful procedures or even alternatives to using animals, protocols that were suspended and not reported. Most of them had to do with expired medications. Every one of these every green dot that I've made on this is another violation. Very close to about 100 different violations. So they did that report. Then they came back 6 months later, and they found a number of repeat violations. When they had come before, they said that they found roach infestations in some of the places. They found dirty surgical suites, all these kinds of things. When they came back, they said, still, we're finding the lights in some of the rooms where the animals are kept are dim because there's so many roaches in the covers over the lights. They still had problems with looking for alternatives to painful procedures. So as a result of all of this, right now on campus, we've learned that there's a team of 9 inspectors from around the country that are here. They say that they're going to be here for about maybe a month, and that they're going to try to evaluate the past 3 years of the university's animal use. This is unheard of. Usually it's 1 or 2 inspectors come, stay a day, maybe the night, and somebody's back there saying, this isn't unusual. I haven't heard anything of ever having a team like this show up at some place. Hey,
5 minutes?
I have 5 minutes. Let me really quickly get to, this is a book called Peacemaking Among Primates, and these are monkeys that used to be out here at the zoo. They were moved to a lab. They were actually sold to or given to a lab in Louisiana after the university got caught violating promises that it wouldn't use the monkeys in any harmful ways. These are just little anecdotes. They don't mean anything, but when we're talking about monkeys, these are monkeys here. Let me add an example of the adult rhesus monkey females who will be treated in the next chapter. He's talking about, this is, they saw mother monkeys would take their babies and they would set them down, and then they would walk away and look in the mirror and look at their babies. And he said, I don't know why they do that. He says, they seem to connect their own behavior, placing their offspring on the floor, to the mirror image. That they do not, like chimpanzees, use the mirror to look at their own reflection may be a matter of how much interest monkeys have in themselves compared to such attractive creatures as their new infants. Fox speculates that apes and humans may simply have reached a higher level of narcissism. He's talking about reconciliation in monkeys. He says, almost accidental reconciliations are typical of rhesus monkeys. They often act as if nothing has happened. Boss is threatened to push her friend Tip out of a huddled group. After the incident, she approaches Tip several times, but each time her opponent withdraws. Boss starts to hunt for flies, grabbing at the air with fast, snatching hand movements. This is a common technique. While so occupied, Boss moves closer and closer to Tip without looking at her. She catches flies in front of Tip and behind her back. At one point, she has to lean on Tip to get a particularly high-flying insect. This contact is maintained and eventually leads to Tip's grooming Boss. So she sort of snuck up. Let's see. I'll finish with this. He says, strictly speaking, the above list does not prove that monkeys know what their behavior is all about. The point is that their actions become more understandable if we assume that they have insight into the social network in which they live. Regarding them as beings with a rich social life, with a rich social knowledge and a will of their own, permits us to interpret data that otherwise would not make any sense. So I'm talking here about a theoretical framework rather than a proven position. This framework, known as cognitive ethology, is more stimulating and promising than the classic view of animals as robot actors in a play that they hardly understand. Instead of arrogantly thinking that we human investigators fathom the meaning of non-human primate behavior better than they do, the impression never leaves me that is the other way around. It takes me thousands of hours of waiting and watching to reach a depth of insight into their social life that, in my estimation, is shallow compared to the insight of the monkeys themselves. Thanks.
So thank all three of you gentlemen for very stimulating presentations, each one in a very different and unique vein. So we're just going to go ahead and open up the floor for comments and questions. And Bob, you're used to using one of these mics and passing it around. So if you'll do this side of the auditorium, or maybe that side, and I'll do this side. So we can have two mics going.
Maybe that means I can go first.
Maybe so. Yeah, go ahead.
So I did research with Dr. Marty Seligman at Cornell, where we induced helplessness into puppies. And we did it in a very torturous way. And in Dr. Seligman's most recent books, he talked about the alternatives to that. And he set himself a true limit to stop using those subjects when he could find a better alternative. And that seemed to be a better than ethical, because we couldn't agree on the ethics of it, nor the volunteer issue. Because, of course, volunteering is a complex thing to me, and I really appreciated the way you three did that. So thank you very much. Good. Now that's mine. Any others?
All right. And, wait, let's use the microphone.
I'm going to kind of throw a wrench, and you may want to take the microphone away, but I'm wondering if we're actually addressing an issue at a level that we should be addressing it. Most biomedical research is used to enhance the well-being of humans, and yet most of it's restricted to people who can afford it. We have an overpopulated Earth. We have over 1 billion people going to bed hungry every night, and we have 25,000 children dying every day from hunger and from diseases that are curable. I'm wondering if the monies going into biomedical research shouldn't, and into longevity research, for example, why do we want to extend the longevity of humans when we've got too many around and we don't give all of those the quality of life? I'm wondering if we shouldn't start talking about redirecting research monies to what is really ethical and important, and that's sustainability and equity among the over-burgeoning human population, which is also affecting other species. And I think that you can talk about the ethics of whether other species have the right to exist, and I frankly think they do. But I know that there's some implications like sociopathic implications in terms of walking away from research that enhances human health to doing something more. But I think that the issue really is for us, not should we go on with these kinds of research experiments, but should we not redirect our energies to something that the whole world can gain from?
A very profound and intriguing point. I'm interested in whether any of you would be willing to respond to what Mara has to say about that.
Yes.
Yes, maybe you agree with her.
So I feel that way about many things. I study cancer, and I ask myself sometimes, why do I study cancer? That's a disease of old people. We've got 10 times too many people on this earth as it is, and so I have to come up with some sort of a justification. I also know that I'm very excited by our exploration of space. The things that we've seen with Hubble, the fact that we've put someone up on the moon, all of that's entirely wasted if you're going to approach this as from the perspective of what should we take care of first. So we certainly have that option as a species. Let's just take care of the basics, whatever that is. Well, fine. First, let's agree on what that is, because there's a lot of people that say the basics is destroying that group and making just my group better. And then there's a whole different perspective of what really constitutes a basic. Is learning about ourselves, our understanding our biology, is understanding ecology and how we fit in with the world, the notion of Gaia. We know so much about that because so many people in so many different fields study it. But why bother if we just have to feed people? So I think many of us have the perspective that you have. I think the problem is we don't share the same ideas about what are the most important things. Let's feed everybody. Okay, that's simple, right? We should feed everybody. Well, then we'll have this huge burst of reproduction, and we'll have another 5 times more people, so that more will die when it all collapses. So, there are consequences, and that's how I would answer you. Yes, we have to decide where to put our resources, but there's not one overwhelming perspective on what's right. And yeah,
feeding people
well,
because of reproduction problem. I'm advocating trying to make resources more equitable, not only for human populations, but for all species.
Mm-hmm.
So if we reduce human population, we have more habitat for other species.
right, but then there are some religions that will be adamantly opposed to that and say that that's evil. Let's settle this by agreeing, though. I think probably there will be a few who don't agree. Let's just say, cut out spending on war, and we'll be able to take care of all the rest of this, okay? And so that's the easy way to solve that
Political campaigns.
Well, I was reflecting on your question. Certainly the hydrocephalus is focused on babies. My taser research is focused on young men who make trouble, who are typically about 25 years old. And the liver cancer is something that comes to people untimely before they're elderly. I'm well aware that the average person over 65 has 5 medications or something like that. I have nothing to do with drugs.
Legal or otherwise? He enjoyed the
wine. Some years ago, when I was a postdoc at a research institute in Boston that was studying children's cancers, and I will admit that I was a coward. I soon quit running through the lobby of that institution to get to my labs. I worked out a way to get through a side door so that I didn't have to look at the kids that were going to be dead within 10 months with childhood leukemia. And that was one of the things that most of the people in the institute were working on in labs, using experimental animals, that some of whom were very susceptible to developing leukemias following radiation or just following the fact that they have the wrong genes. And those contributed very greatly to the development of chemotherapy, such that 10 years later, childhood leukemia, if caught soon after its origin or after it starts, is 95% curable. And I would be very surprised if much anybody in this room would want to watch the kids of at the first time, or the early stages, who were going to die, rather than having looking at the children who survive. And that's a tough one.
I just want to broaden the conversation just a little and talk about the spiritual context of this. And, all major philosophies and religions teach that we are all one. We're all one energy. And that what we do to each other comes back to us. And so we have lived within this paradigm that we can poison and utilize, hunt for fun and trophy, stick animals down our gullet and kill 1 million farm animals an hour to give us heart disease and obesity, and destroy our oceans and our web of life. The statistics are that over the last 35 years, 35% of all wildlife across this planet has decreased that much. 35% is down in populations overall. And that right now they're speculating that we're killing about 1% of all non-human life on Earth every year. Now you take that tangent out and you apply it to what we're experimenting on and what we're doing to other creatures who are the web of life that we are supposed to steward. And you see that we're making the wrong decisions and that we need a life-giving paradigm. Cancer, we're supposed to be, he's talking about leukemia, it's risen to where you can expect 1 out of 3 people on Earth to have cancer before they die. And it's not about animal experimentation, it's about what we're doing to the web of life at the base. It's us. It's not, and we're taking it out on other species. We're experimenting on them when it's our choices that are creating this paradigm. And we really need to realize that what we're doing to other creatures, decision by decision, choice by choice, and that includes lab experimentation, is about us and our choices and what we're doing to the web of life at the very core. We need to address the core issues and not try to medicate it with some kind of experimentation on animals that aren't even related to us.
Any responses?
So it's correct. We are really damaging this world in a horrible way. And I can say very confidently that all of that is not the fault of animal research. So those issues you raise have to be addressed. Now, embedded in that statement, there were some references to issues like, how do we as humans view animals? Maybe we'll want to go into additional discussion about that. I think that's a very relevant topic for discussion. Otherwise, all I can do is agree with you. Yeah, we're really screwing things up, and vote Tuesday.
Well, unlike a couple other commenters, I'd like to focus the discussion a little bit and sort of broaden it, give the panelists, I guess, something more to respond to and hear from you all a little bit more. The central question to me is always, is experimenting on non-human animals, and especially monkeys, ethical? And that's what I'd like to hear more discussion about. Largely because the level of discussion I see in the community is not very high. We tend to say, as a couple of speakers have already, that there are benefits to people. And the assumption is as long as there are benefits to people, then what we're doing must be ethical. If we're doing something to cure childhood leukemia, if we're doing something to cure hydrocephalus, then it must be ethical. Well, benefits alone are not an ethical argument. They may be part of an ethical argument, but they are not an ethical argument. I want to respond quickly to something Eric said, and then rephrase this and let you all respond, if you will. Eric said that the resolution of the Dane County Board of Supervisors is a fatal flaw because they're looking for a panel to make decisions that all of us ought to be making for ourselves. I agree that ethical thinking is really important that we all do it and we all wrestle with these issues. I think it's an excellent point. But it's important to know that the reason that some of us, and I was behind this effort, went to the county board was that the university declined to look at that question seriously. The university didn't want to answer the question, is it ethical to experiment on monkeys? So we went outside the university to try to get an independent study with the purpose not of having somebody make decisions for all of us and tell us if it's ethical or not, but with the purpose of engaging the community in the kind of discussion that we're doing right now. The university was strongly opposed to that kind of community discussion. We were interested in the process and the discussion and raising the discussion of ethical issues. The university didn't want that to happen. On the other hand, I'm very glad that Eric's participating in this kind of forum tonight, which I think is really important. John Webster, every time I listen to somebody talk about these issues, I want to know, okay, what's the ethical argument? Is it ethical or not? And if it is or isn't, why? Why? What exactly are you saying? And I listen to John Webster speak, and he seems to say, well, it's helped people, my work has helped people, and I couldn't get human volunteers. Well, is that the argument then? Is that saying it's ethical because it helps people and I couldn't get human volunteers? Mr. Webster, you didn't get animal volunteers either. We could have said I couldn't get free people to volunteer, so I experimented on prisoners. That doesn't make it ethical. There's got to be something more to the argument. So I'll stop there and hope that you all can respond and start to address what I think the real issue is. Is experimenting on non-human animals ethical, or isn't it? Why or why not? And let's try to raise the discussion. Thank you.
I'm not clear what your question was.
I have no idea how that fits into my argument.
Is experimenting on non-human animals ethical? If it is, why? What's your argument for it being ethical?
Well, I believe it's ethical, or I wouldn't be doing it. I know that there are major human diseases, which I've described, and I believe I have the skills to improve the treatment of those diseases. If I could use human experiment or human subjects, I would, as I do there's research I do on human subjects, which is permitted. But the kind of things that I just described here would not be permitted by the university, or I think anybody. So I choose to use animals. I know that the animals are treated, I've been present in experiments on all of these animals, and they're treated the same way you would be treated if you went to a hospital and were anesthetized. There's no pain.
So, good example of the point that I made earlier, where you really have to be cautious about what you believe. Rick Merolt has claimed over and over again that the university refuses to address the issue of whether research with animals is ethical. Well, there has been a meeting last year, a committee meeting, where this very issue was addressed. And two individuals, one an ethicist who's a member of the faculty at UW-Madison, and the other me, addressed that and outlined very clearly an ethical standard. I keep hearing that we don't address it. That does address it. Look it up yourself. What it doesn't do is agree with Mr. Merle's perspective. So without presenting that whole argument right now, I can say it depends ultimately on how you view animals with respect to people. We believe humans have rights. The question is, do animals have rights of that same sort so that we have to get informed consent from them before we do something? Well, we obviously can't get informed consent. So does that mean we can't work on animals? Well, let's look at this. Consider spay and neuter clinics. We can't get informed consent from pets as to whether they want to be spayed, and yet we do it and we all think it's right, and animal activists push that strongly. Well, I'm sorry. It's either you either have to have informed consent or you can't do anything, or you don't consider animals in the same way as you do humans. Now, it's a much harder issue when you're dealing with non-human primates, and that's where Mr. Merle likes to discuss this, and I think that's a very legitimate point on his part, and we don't have spay and neuter clinics for non-human primates, so that particular argument doesn't hold, but it gives you a sense for how you address this issue, humans versus non-humans. And my point is, no matter what, you have to draw a line somewhere. Everyone will draw a line somewhere. Do we draw a line between human and non-human in terms of whether something should be assigned rights? Do we say, well, rats and mice, we trap them in our garages all the time with snap traps, so clearly we don't think they have rights, so it's okay to use them. So, tell me where to draw the line. I find it easiest to draw the line between humans and non-humans because there are some characteristics that humans have that other animals don't. I don't expect all of you to agree with that. But you're going to be drawing lines, whatever your perspective.
Eric, what are those characteristics? You said there's characteristics that humans have.
Yes, there are characteristics that humans have that other animals don't have. There's an incredible literature on that, and I will refer you to that. But one of the simple things that I can say is we're having discussions like this about rights and what they mean. We are considering, do we have rights? We are considering, do other animals have rights? This kind of a discussion does not take place. And some people consider that to have a certain moral meaning with respect to rights in animals.
I guess I would just really say something about the issue about informed consent. Certainly, with the monkeys, I don't know how, certainly we would never ever get informed consent for people to be generations kept in cages or essentially jail cells over and generation after generation after generation. We wouldn't even begin to ask for informed consent for something like that. We give informed consent in ways for children who are unable to give informed consent. If they need surgery, they need some sort of medical care, their parents may say, yes, let's hurt them in order to help them. But it's always with their well-being in mind. One of the things, just real quickly too, was the idea that Eric said that the issue about the ethics of experiments on animals has been answered, and it was last year, and actually Dr. Robert Streifer is here, the bioethicist that he referred to, who was at that committee meeting as well, and we disagree about this, but it seemed to me that his argument was that because the university follows all the applicable laws, that therefore it is ethical. And that doesn't seem to me, I think that goes to Mr. Merle's question about what's your basis for determining whether something is ethical. As a follow-up to that, though, I think it's something that might be germane here, is that there was just recently an investigation of a researcher at the university named Michelle Basso, who for a number of years was having problems with the things that she was putting into monkeys' heads. Screws were going in too far, brain abscesses and all of this. The veterinary staff at the university argued with her for years and years over this, and finally she was just, she filed a grievance with they took away her animal privileges. Finally, the the university did. And she filed a grievance, and she just won her grievance, and they said that, in fact, that the university, they shouldn't have done that because they didn't give her due process. But interestingly, that's why this is germane, is that the university committee, the faculty committee that looked at this, they said one of the reasons that they should not have pulled her privileges to use animals was that the all-campus Animal Care and Use Committee weren't knowledgeable about the use of monkeys. They said they didn't have the expertise to make decisions about her use of monkeys. And yet that same body was the one that said, yes, it's ethical to use monkeys in research. So on the one hand, we have the university saying that the committee that took her privileges away isn't knowledgeable about the use of monkeys in research. And yet, at the same time, the university is saying that same body was qualified to make ethical decisions about the use of monkeys. So, I don't know, it seems very confused to me. I don't think the university has been open about this. So that, I guess that's I can go on forever, but.
I think it's good that we're having this discussion today. However, I would like to respond to a couple of things. First of all, Eric Sandgren, that you said the effort to get together a panel of people in the community to discuss whether or not it's ethical to experiment on animals, that this would be ludicrous, was your word. And it would be ludicrous, according to you, because if they said, yes, it was ethical, then everything's just fine. And if they said, no, it wasn't ethical, then it would not be good. And that we would have to take whatever their answer was and just live with it, which I think that is the part that I don't agree with. It would be an opening of discussion where we would hear the results and we could think about it. This is the university where we are to sift and winnow information, and I think that would have given us more of an opportunity to do that. Whereas this is good, but we hear a very one-sided sort of, these are the experiments, for instance, John Webster, you say, these are my experiments, and they're very concrete examples you give us. But we don't have the opportunity that a panel would to be able to go into a little more depth about that. For instance, your comment about the taser experiments with pigs. It seems to me like a lot of the experiments that I've read about, and I have read quite a lot of those experiments in depth, it's common sense. You don't direct an electronic device straight at the heart of a person and wonder if it maybe could kill them. Well, of course it can kill them, and we already know it's killed several hundred. Not necessarily by going straight to the heart, but it's just common sense. Why would you subject pigs to the experiments that I'm aware of that you were doing? And I think you're giving them drugs or intoxicating them in some way to try and parallel some drunk lowlife or something that you're going to taser. And no thought to what that was maybe like for the pigs. When we talk about restraining monkeys for 3 days at a time, this is not what was intended in the monkey's life. I think that's incredibly cruel, no matter what else you're doing to them. And you talk about whether or not we have to get informed consent from humans. Yes, we do, but you keep saying, I think it was John Webster, well, nobody would volunteer for that. Well, I can assure you, and I'm sure you know, none of these animals would volunteer for any of this. And they do not have the ability. We are the ones with the voices for the animals. They don't have the ability. And I think we should think about the ethics of it. And I do know some people who, perhaps I won't go there, it's okay. Those are my thoughts, and also to comment on what Mr. Bogle said about the various examples he gave of just how much do we really learn from all this basic science. I do know, for instance, that the FDA requires that we experiment on animals in rather heinous ways to see whether or not we can use certain drugs, and then we find out about 80% of them are actually detrimental for humans. How much money was wasted on the other 20% that may have been good for humans, but we didn't know because we did it on a different species. That's it.
Any responses or reactions to any of that?
Sure. With respect to the panel, based on what you said, which is that, of course, we wouldn't follow an ethical decision, that's not the point. I would agree. That's what I thought was ludicrous about the panel, that they would be set up to make a decision. That is ludicrous. I think it's a great idea to get as much information as possible and to make that public. I've worked for that for a lot of years. This is not by any means the only venue of this type that I've been in. So we agree. I want the discussion to go forward. It's silly for us to think, though, that a committee can decide for the rest of us whether it's ethical. That was the point I made earlier.
Excuse me, I think that decision is not going to be a decision, it's going to be an opinion of the ethics committee. It wasn't going to have any binding authority at all, it was just going to be their opinion.
I think I'd say for everybody, if you're not sure, go back and read the resolution. They were supposed to be making a decision about reporting back about whether it was ethical or not. So, well, I'm like I say, read everybody. Again, here's an example of an issue that gets into the first thing that I said, that it's not simple, that you can't just go out and listen to somebody and take their word for it. And I'll refer specifically to that comment about common sense, because I've heard that often. And it's a perfect example of why we do science. We have this thing called common sense. Well, of course you don't, whatever. And one of the things that science does is shows us just how much common sense is absolutely false. So, for instance, the study, and this was brought up earlier, about alcohol and its effect on fetuses. Well, I've heard the argument many times, well, of course we know that women aren't supposed to drink during pregnancy. All right, fine, let's not study it at all. Then all those women who do drink during pregnancy, because we can't make them not drink, and their affected fetuses will have no idea how to deal with those. It's not the fault of the fetus that the mother drank. So if we can do studies to understand precisely what the disease is like, what the damage is like in those fetuses, we then know how to treat those fetuses. And we're finding that lower and lower and lower amounts of alcohol have some effect. Let's define what that effect is. We use epidemiological studies whenever we can, but those are very much not controlled studies. So again, you're going to have to do a lot of work. You can't just say, well, it's common sense and let it go at that, because most of the time you'll be wrong. If you really want to understand the issue, you'll have to look into it more than that. And that's kind of too bad. I'm sorry, it's not so simple, but that's the way it is.
Hi. Just so everyone knows, I do work at the Research Animal Resources Center on campus. Is that me?
We get the data for a second. Feedback here.
Should I keep going? No. Hello. Okay. This sort of touches on the question that came up earlier about broader issues and our species' ethical obligations, or maybe what should be our ethical obligations. I spent 10 years in the Natural History Museum world before I switched jobs. And what I did is I was the registrar there. I was a collections manager. We took museum specimens and labeled them and entered data into computers and things like this. And I met a lot of really wonderfully driven, passionate scientists who spent years and decades of their professional careers going out and collecting fossils and bird specimens and geologic specimens. You know, geologists get very excited about sand. So, and they collect these things and they write down precisely where they found it, measure the composition of the sample, and put it in a box, and put that box in a box, and put that box in a warehouse and say, we'll catalog that later, we'll get to that. There's immense knowledge stored in the backs of museums that aren't on display. And so I can believe that, I mean, there were some projects I worked on from specimens that had been collected 20, 30, 40 years previous. I imagine there's lots of information and data that have been done on animal models and things like that, not all of which has been published, data that's been published, but hasn't been picked up on, that hasn't immediately led to some brilliant cure for a human affliction or disease. So I really am interested in being able to take all that wonderful information out there and translate it into either cures, or I think it's also valuable to know if something doesn't work. Oh, this doesn't work. Let's not give that to people. Let's not tell people that this is a possible cure or a hope. So how do we go about amassing all this data, or we've got the data, how do we go about translating it to the clinics?
One of the things that Rick Bogle and I agree on is that translational research is not as active an area as it could be and maybe should be. I would like to see more of the basic studies translated into, let's say, cures as an endpoint. And I have nothing against that. I think it's an important component that needs to be built into all of this. If we completely eliminate animal research, then we lose a huge fraction of the basic knowledge that we could be able to use to put into translational research. So I'm not for eliminating that, but I'm all for expanding the studies so that we do a better job translationing. And actually, that's what NIH is doing right now. The scientific community understands this. The things Mr. Bogle were reading from were published by the scientists, many of the scientists who use the animals, saying, okay, we're getting this stuff, we're learning things, let's put it to more practical uses. So I favor that. And if there is a shift of funding away from animal research toward that, as one individual scientist, no, I'm not speaking for the campus or anything else, I favor that. I think there's not enough money. So as a scientist, I would love to see a lot more money put into science. That way you keep the same amount of funding for animal work and you increase the amount of funding for translational work. But, you know, the pie's only so big, so yeah, I think translational is underfunded.
And after John offers a response, we have time for one more question.
When a neurosurgeon came to me and described the problem of hydrocephalus, I went to databases that have almost every scientific article you ever want and put in intracranial pressure monitor. People have done work on this area before, but currently you cannot buy a permanently implantable pressure sensors like I described. So that's what we're working on, okay? And that's the way we go. We go out and look at all the other data, see if somebody's done it before. And if they haven't, then I'm ready to work on it.
Hi. I want to thank you all so much for all this information. It's great. And Mr. Sandgren, what I really liked you saying was that you should do more research. You should find out about this yourself. So could each of you give us some suggestions of where to start if you want to learn more about this, some websites or some books or some people that we should look up?
An excellent question to end on. A little bibliography, if you will. Just some suggestions of sources that the average layperson can go to further enlighten themselves on this important topic.
Well, any one of you can use Google and put in implantable cranial pressure sensor, and you'll get about 100,000 hits, okay, if you want to do that. But at the university, there's a website called INSPEC, I-N-S-P-E-C, that has almost 5 million articles there, and you can search it on keywords, and you can find everything that's ever been done from a engineering side. And then you go to the NIH website, PubMed, P-U-B-M-E-D, and it's got every medical article that's ever been published. Between the two of those, you're going to find everything.
I would encourage you all to look at a couple of websites, the Foundation for Biomedical Research, as well as the National Association for Biomedical Research. These are www.fbr.org or nabr.org. They're excellent websites that include much information about the use of animals in research, everything from basic science to FDA drug type experiments. And also there are topics related to the ethics of the use of animals in research. And I would also encourage you, each and every one of you, to talk to scientists. I'm a scientist, and I can tell you that there's not a day that goes by that I don't think about the ethics of using animals in research. And the day I stop thinking about it, the day I stop caring about it, is the day I quit. It's an extremely important issue. And furthermore, the sort of topics that Rick Bogle brought up earlier, relating the use of animals and scientists to the Holocaust or to slavery, I personally find this kind of thing very offensive. For me as a scientist, it's about intent. And when I get up in the morning, what I'm trying to do is to make humans live a better life and to make animals live a better life. My intent is not to hurt animals. And I think this is a really critical thing to keep in mind. And please talk to scientists, because I know no scientists who intend to hurt animals when they get up in the morning. So, thank you.
Just real quick, I think what you should do is actually don't use PETA or HSUS or one of the two organizations that she mentioned, Foundation for Biomedical Research and National Association for Biomedical Research. They're both, like PETA and Humane Society, are special interests. They have a very clear bias one way or the other. I think, though, if you use PubMed, as thank you, Webster recommended, the trick about PubMed is that you have to narrow your search terms so that you can actually find published scientific papers on the issues that you're interested in. And then you can actually find critiques of, for instance, the things that I cited, criticisms of animal research that are published in scientific journals, as opposed to looking at it on some sort of a very clearly sort of biased website. There really is a lot of work looking at the reason that animal research doesn't translate into benefits for humans. And it's only new, and people have been astounded at what they found when they've actually done these meta-analyses, looked at hundreds and hundreds of studies, sometimes the most highly cited studies, and tried to find out how many of those actually resulted in some sort of benefit. And the results are really not very good. This isn't me. These are papers published in scientific journals. So I hope you'll learn to do that. It's not an easy thing to learn how to do, to use these databases and find them, but that information is out there. And I certainly wouldn't turn to looking at a very one-sided, biased website to try to think that's what's going to teach me what's right or wrong. That's absurd. So anyway, I guess that's my final vote there.
Sorry. Hi, I'm Robert Stryker. I'm a bioethicist here on campus, and I do a semester-long course on animal bioethics. And if you don't want to go through the 5 million readings in PubMed, I'm happy to share the syllabus that I've picked up. So it's just a couple pages. There's sections on the moral worth of animals. There's sections on animal cognition and emotion. There's a section on the research uses of animals, the agricultural uses of animals. And I'm happy to share that much more focused array of readings with anybody who's interested. If you'd like, I'd be happy to give out my email address afterwards.
Very good. Well, we have run out of time, and I do want to bring it to a close. We could go on sharing resources, but please, if you would like, you're free to stick around a little bit and engage in some one-to-one conversation. But thanks so much to our panelists.
Thank you all for coming.